Okay, so we are slowly beginning. I would like to welcome all of you to the mini-symposium on our psychology program, organized by our psychology program. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ayşe. I'm the current Dean of Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. I'm not a psychologist. I am an IR person. So everything you discuss here today, I have no clue about it. So it's going to be a new for me as well. I'd like to thank our coordinator of the symposium, Emre Hoca, Gül Hoca, and Özlem Hoca, who is our distinguished research fellow, for all their works. We are delighted to have our visitors, Ayşe, Üskül, and Thomas from Sussex and Chicago. We are looking forward to your discussions. So I know you don't want to, you don't want to listen to me, but one of the things that I would just like to remind you is that our psychology program at Sabancı is our most recent program. We started the undergraduate program in 2014, thanks to Çağla Hocam's, intensive work. And then the program continued growing substantially with a master's program, and now we have 2 PhD programs as well. And it is, now among the most important psychology programs in Turkey. It's getting recognized internationally as well. So this is a major accomplishment in a period of very few years, only 10 years. And therefore, I'd like to congratulate all our faculty members here who are, with us today. Our most recent participant, our most recent colleague who joined us is Feyza Hoca, who joined the program last summer from Boğaziçi. We have Nilgün Hoca here, and Arzu is, even though she's in the wrong faculty, she is part of us as as an honorary faculty of us. So we all have our, program faculty members, UNCO, and our grad students, undergrad students, all of whom are here today contributing to this wonderful symposium. So I will, turn the floor, give the word to Özlem Hoca, our distinguished research fellow, who we are honored to have with us every year now. And her contributions, it's very few days she's here, but every time she is with us, it makes a significant impact. And we are really, really thankful for that. Thank you, Özlem Hocam. Thanks for coming in. Thank you. And this is your mic.
Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Özlem Ayduk, and I am a Boğaziçi graduate, and I'm currently a faculty member at UC Berkeley in the psychology department. And as Meltem Hoca already told you, I have been part of the Sabancı's Distinguished Fellowship Program, and in my role as a fellow with Emre and Gül, we have started these mini-symposium, sometimes we call it workshop, mini-talk, mini-workshop series. Now, this is the 3rd installment of that series. The first one was an in-person meeting in this room in December 22. It was on emotion regulation, and we had Maya Tamir and Iris Mouse as our guest speakers. In May 2023, we had a remote session on relationships and health. And our speakers there were Jeffrey Simpson and Amy Gordon. And today is the 3rd session, or the 3rd installment. And our theme broadly is on cultural psychology. And we are honored to have 2 very esteemed scholars who have done important work in this domain. Thomas Talhem. How did I say that?
You got it.
I passed. Okay. And Ayşe, that one was easy. Okay. For a change, yes. So we're going to have a kind of split this session into 2 halves. In the first half, Thomas will first tell us about his data. And that'll be 35, 40 minutes. We'll have a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, both from the audience and from the from Zoom. I will moderate the Q&A. We'll have a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and repeat it again with Ayşe. So before I turn the mic to Thomas, let me tell you a little bit about him. So he's an associate professor of behavioral science at the University of Chicago Booth Business School. He received his PhD from the University of Virginia in 2015, has lived in China for 7 years. I was drilling him about his experience there in various roles on and off, not continuously, I believe, as a freelance journalist, Fulbright scholar, etc. And these experiences were obviously very foundational for his work on the rice theory of culture, which he's really well known for. The theory argues that because rice agriculture depends on a lot of coordinated, complex irrigation systems, and many more man hours than wheat agriculture, people who are engaged in growing rice tend to be, so what is it? They coordinate their interdependent, they coordinate their behaviors with one another. People living in the north of China cultivating wheat relatively are, less so. So this work has been published in Science. I'm sure you have all heard about this. Very kind of garnered a lot of attention, both from academic and non-academic circles. But today you're going to be talking about something slightly different, I believe, and which this work I know less about. So without further ado, I leave the stage, and title of talk is Data from 100 Cultures Reveals Collectivism Isn't What People Think It Is. Thank you.
This here. All right, is that okay? People online hear me? All right. Okay, so before I begin, thank you for having me here. This is my first time in Turkey, and I'm excited to be here. This project is a huge project that's taken me like over 10 years. I know Ayşe saw a version of this probably 5 years ago. So hopefully it's better than it was then. Because it's taken so long, I thought I would just recognize all the people who helped me collect all the data that you're seeing today, including Arzu, who helped. She was probably one of the first people to collect data on this. Early on in this project. So anyway, I want to thank everybody right here before I get into any of the data. All right, so okay, I want to tell a little story about this study. And it starts when I was an undergrad studying at Michigan. So I was at the University of Michigan, and there I am wearing the shirt to prove it. Because I was there, I think I was fortunate as somebody who was interested in culture. I was fortunate because there's a lot of cultural psychologists at the University of Michigan. It's a total accident. It's just where I grew up. So I was just lucky to bumble into a place where there were all these people who had like all this experience and knowledge about cultural psychology. So I got to learn things while I was there that I wouldn't have been able to learn if I had been training somewhere that didn't have so many cultural psychologists. And so one of the things that they taught me was an open secret in the field. I call it open because I'll show you some citations that were published already. So, it was out there. But I call it a secret because I don't think people widely know this, especially not at the time. That open secret that they taught me was that self-report scales don't work across cultures. So they taught me not to use these self-report scales. And so if you look at, for example, my early rice theory paper, if you look back in that paper, there's like 1 or 2 sentences that probably nobody remembers, but it says I'm specifically not using self-report scales in the study. And it's kind of weird because if you're a psychologist and you want to study something, what's the first step in measuring something? You're a grad student, you want to measure something, what's the first step? You give people a self-report scale, right? Like if you want to measure depression, you give people a depression scale. If you want to measure positive emotion, you give them a positive emotion scale, right? So it's kind of weird that I had this paper with a bunch of different measures in it, none of which are self-report measures of cultural differences. It's kind of weird, right? Well, I did that because of this, okay? Now, what does it mean to not work? Okay, that's kind of a vague notion, right? Let me show you some examples of not work. So here's a study by Kai-Ping Peng, Richard Nesbitt at the University of Michigan. They tested people in the US and China on cultural differences in values. And by work, I'm going to compare this to what people think the scales should be finding. Okay, So I want to compare it to our expectations. So for example, in one of the values that they tested in this study was independence. So how important is independence to you? And I don't think I need to tell you like what people generally expect there. They tested people in the US and people in China. What country do you think, what culture do you think people are supposed to agree more with independence? You just shout it out. US, right? Like should be the US, right? The expectation's obvious and there's the results. Study 2, now it's significant. China's higher, right? Like that seems like a problem. Let's just take another one from their study. Loyalty. Which culture should be higher on loyalty? China, right? There we go. There's study 2. Now it's significant in the other direction, right? So America is higher on loyalty. This seems like a problem, right? In their study, what they did is they took all the values that they looked at and they said, what is the percentage of the time that the cultural difference went in the predicted direction? And what's the percentage of the time that it was in the opposite direction? And it's basically a coin flip, okay? So they could have just flipped a coin and you basically get the same results as that study. Here's just another example. This one's Shinobu Kitayama, who's at Michigan. He gave people a scale to measure interdependence across cultures. So here's the US, UK, Germany. What goes here? Japan, right? So US, #1 out of these 4 countries in interdependence, right? Seems like a problem, okay? Now, there are several meta-analyses on this. Like you might think, well, maybe I'm just cherry picking a few studies that found odd results. Like, no, there are meta-analyses on this, okay? Meta-analyses that are summarizing a bunch of studies showing these peculiar results, right? So here's Steve Heine's meta-analysis on this. 76 studies. The chances that the results show that East Asia is more collectivistic than the US, Canada, Western Europe, no different from flipping a coin. They tried it 76 times and you could just flip a coin, right? That's the problem, okay? So what do you do at that point? So when I was in undergrad, people were sort of puzzling through this problem, right? And thinking about how do we deal with this as a field, right? Like the fundamental tool that we're using doesn't seem to be working, right? So what do we do? One is you could just reject our expectations. You could say like, well, maybe everybody's wrong about this idea that East Asia should be more collectivistic than the US, right? Like if we're scientists, we should follow the data. The data is telling us that we're wrong, so let's just do that. These are the only 2 citations I could find where anybody makes that argument. Basically, I don't meet many people who want to make that argument, okay? Like most people that I meet are still convinced that there is some cultural difference out there corresponding to something like what people think. So most of the field didn't go in that direction. Instead, most of the field went in this direction, which is to say, it's probably a problem with our tools, okay? Like our microscopes have some sort of problem with them, and we got to fix that microscope, okay? So let me just show you a few examples of what the problem with the microscope could be. So self-report's a flawed method to measure cultural differences. There are a few studies on response styles across cultures. So here, the idea is that people in different cultures have different ways of responding to surveys, and those are messing up our results. So, for example, you could give people a survey, and if they have an acquiescent response style, they just agree to everything. And you could put contradictory statements in there, and they would just agree with both because they're just being nice and agreeable, right? Or you could have like a middle response style where it's like, oh, I don't know, I can't make decisions. I'm just going to stay in the middle. Okay, that's the safe areas, like is in the middle. Okay. And if those are different across cultures, then that could mess up our results. Okay, that's one explanation. Kaiping Peng's explanation in his paper that I showed you before is that the questions are too abstract. So when he shows you these items about like how important is independence to you, maybe people are imagining really different things in different countries, right? So if we're just writing these abstract words and expecting people across a bunch of different countries to understand these in the exact same way, maybe that's the problem, okay? Steve Heine has a paper on the reference group effect. I won't go into this in a whole lot of detail, but the idea is that we implicitly compare ourselves to people around us, and that can mess up our ratings. So we as psychologists are trying to compare people across cultures, but people are implicitly comparing themselves within their culture, and that could be a problem. Okay, I want to notice though, tell you something. Have you noticed something in the field of cultural psychology? I feel like this sort of went unsaid over the last 10 or 15 years, but the field kind of changed without ever really issuing a document or formal pronouncement. But if you look at the scales that are the new scales in the last 10, 15 years, that people talk about the most, people are maybe the most excited about. Have you ever noticed anything about those scales? So like Michelle Gelfand has the tightness looseness scale, and that scale is really different from old scales. What's different about it? Well, it has items like people in this country almost always comply with social norms. You notice how that's not a self-report, right? They're not asking you about yourself. They're not rating. It's not I comply with norms. It's the people around me comply with norms, right? Here's another example. The relational mobility scale is one that's fairly recent and fairly popular. And just so we know that I'm not like accusing other people of something bad, like I'm on this paper too. And so in this study, like we tested relational mobility around the world, and in it we have items like it is easy for them to meet new people. Again, we're not asking people to rate themselves. Instead, people are using what we could call culture report. So it's not self-report, it's culture report, okay? So this, again, this is an important thing that we've done as a field. A lot of researchers now use these scales. And I see this as a reaction to all those problems that I showed you before. Like that's a solution to those problems. If you think that self-report is problematic, well, this gets around that, right? But I want to argue that there's problems with that, right? If we give up self-report, maybe problem isn't the right word, but at least there are costs. If we give up self-report, we're sacrificing some things, okay? For one, we might be just measuring people's pluralistic ignorance, right? People, maybe nobody, personally has this value or goal, but they think everybody else around them does. And so it'll be difficult to pull those apart if we only ask people about what they think other people think, okay? And second, we lose the ability to measure individual differences. I can't tell you how many times I've seen papers that take the relational mobility scale and then put it in like a mediation model at the individual level. They treat it like a self-report scale, even though it is not a self-report measure, right? And sometimes it works and then it gets published and everybody just pretends it's a self-report scale. Sometimes it doesn't work and then we probably just don't hear about those studies. But I think sometimes we want to measure individual differences, right? So here's an example from that relational mobility study. So we had 16,000 people across 39 cultures. It's a lot of people, right? And relational mobility, so the ability to meet new people and choose who you're friends with, it seems like that should depend on things like demographic differences, right? And with 16,000 people, we sure have enough statistical power to find those differences, right? Well, how about something like age? Not significant. 16,000 people, age not significant. People socioeconomic status, not significant. Okay. Now, I mean, that's good, right? I mean, that's good because we're asking people to report on their culture, not on themselves. And the fact that it's not related to their individual characteristics, it makes sense, right? Because we're not asking them about themselves. So good. Maybe they're actually reporting something about their culture and not themselves. So that's good. But realize that we've sacrificed something, right? We've now sacrificed the ability to measure those individual differences. Now, just to show you a contrast, these are other things that we measured, and we did ask them about themselves in this one. And so if you look for demographic differences in all these self-reports, you find a lot of them, okay? So it's not something weird about the sample or whatever. It's just that when you ask people about their culture, you lose the ability to measure individual differences, at least sometimes, right? Okay. I want to tell you that, I want to argue that all of those methodological critiques, they have some evidence for them. So I'm not rejecting response style. I'm not rejecting the idea that scales are too abstract and all of that. But instead, I think they missed the more fundamental problem of what was going on. I think the more fundamental problem was what was in our heads, okay? Let me lay that out. So what do we think about when we think about collectivism or interdependence? One nice way to answer this question is to go to Google and then do an image search. Just type in collectivism, do an image search, and what images pop up when you search for collectivism? Well, I did that, and this is what I found. Stuff like this, right? So we have like a Chinese propaganda poster. We have these like this office culture here with all their hands in there, like these puzzle pieces fitting together. We have Spock telling us about the virtues of socialism, right? What's going on in these pictures? Like, what is this telling us? Right? What is this telling us that people have associations with collectivism? We have things like prioritizing everybody over the individual, right? We have these people who are super friendly and smiley, right? Like, look at those broad smiles. You also notice that if you look carefully, these are all three people from different walks of life. So we have a soldier, we have a laborer, so this guy presumably works in a factory, and this person is presumably a farmer. So these are not people who would know each other, right? They live in different areas, they have different jobs, they work for different work units. These people would not know each other, but they hold hands because they're on the same team, right? That's collectivism. That's an image that we have of collectivism, okay? I want to argue that we have a mix of two different types of intuitions. If you ask people about collectivism, or if you think about collectivism, I want to argue that we have two types of intuitions. On one side, we have the warm, fuzzy collectivism, what I call it. And I think that's mostly those pictures that I just showed you, okay? These are things like positive emotions, being nice, those broad smiles on those people, right? That's the warm, fuzzy. It extends near and far, like the farmer and the factory worker. We're all the same, right? It's about sharing and non-competition. You have that sort of socialism element, and sort of like non-competition that goes with that. On the other side, I think we also have intuitions about what I call responsibilism. Maybe after today, I can convince one person in this room to start using this word. It rolls off the tongue, responsibilism. Here's what responsibilism is. It's behavior over emotions, right? It emphasizes concrete actions rather than how I think about you, how I feel about you, my representation of you in my head. Like what's more important is what I do, okay? What we do, all right? Warm fuzzy is not required. It's not everybody near and far, but instead it's tight known others. It's the people close to me, right, that I interact with a lot. It's not about sharing a non-competition, but instead it's roles, relationships, and duties. One way I like to say this is it's kind of the not fun parts of collectivism. Okay, so sometimes I'll tell my students, like, if you're imagining collectivism and it seems like it's not a lot of fun, you're probably right, right? You're probably close, right? And then competition's okay. Actually, like around the world, if you correlate collectivism with measures of people's endorsement of competition, they're actually positively correlated. Just seems like a paradox. All right. What I want to argue is that the classic scales that psychologists have used to measure collectivism mix those two intuitions. So we have some of the left, we have some of the right, and then you get messy results. And that's why, okay? So let's look at the most cited, or one of the most cited collectivism scales, the singular scale. It has items like, I feel good when I cooperate with others, right? What's going on here? We've got the warm fuzzy here about feeling good. And then we have others, sorry, my highlighting is a little bit off. Others, right? It doesn't matter who it is. It's just people. Yeah, I feel good when I cooperate with people. Do I know them? It doesn't matter, right? It's others, right? So that's warm fuzzy collectivism right there, right in the scale, okay? Here's another one. The well-being of my coworkers is important to me, right? Again, we have the niceness, we have the caring. Coworkers is maybe a little bit closer because it's theoretically somebody in my organization. What I'm going to argue is that that's not enough, right? In a lot of modern companies, you have a lot of coworkers. I don't necessarily care about somebody that I've never met before, right? So I think that's actually not close enough, right? Coworker, not close enough. Here's another one. Some people emphasize winning. I'm not one of them. It's important to maintain harmony within my group, right? Like you can feel the warm emotions in these. All right. I want to show you some evidence that people still hold this intuition. And by people, I mean at least psychologists. So I surveyed published researchers in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology. So I emailed everybody who published an article in a particular year. About half grew up in Western countries, 16% in East Asia. And I showed them items like this, and I asked them to guess. I said, I have data on this from China and the US. Please guess which culture you think agreed more with these items. Okay, so the well-being of my coworkers is important to me. What I found first is that a lot of cultural psychologists didn't want to play my game. They knew they were being tested, and like the safe answer is like about equal. So, you know, about 60% just didn't want to guess. So that's fine. Don't have to play my game. But of the people who were willing to take a guess, the majority were guessing EC, right? So again, warm, fuzzy intuition. Here's the actual survey data from China and the US. It's Americans like that item more, right? Like my MBA students at the University of Chicago, they love that item, right? 5% of people guessed that direction. Okay. I feel good when I cooperate with others. Again, a lot of people don't want to take a guess, but of the people who were willing to take a guess, more people guessed East Asia. As a comparison, I also had my MBA students play this game. Here are their guesses. A little bit less hesitant to play the game, but similar guesses. Here's the actual data. So again, US agreeing more with, I feel good when I cooperate with others. So let me summarize all the guesses of the cultural psychologists on this one graph. And let me orient you. So here on the x-axis, we have people's guesses. So if it's all the way over here, it means 100% of people thought that China would agree more. If it's over here, then it's 100% of people thought Americans would agree more. Okay, so here we have their guesses. On the y-axis, we have the actual survey data. So if it's up there, then it means Americans actually agreed more. That's Cohen's D. And then down below, China actually agreed more. So if people's, here's a sample item. So I often do my own thing is one of the survey items. Almost everybody thought Americans would agree more. They were correct, although the effect size is pretty small, right? So that's just one item. If people's intuitions are correct, we should generally find points around the line like this. When they think Americans are going to agree more, they actually do. When they think that people in China are going to agree more, they actually do. Okay, let's look at the actual data. So if you have these guesses, you would be more accurate to just guess the opposite. Okay, that would be a way of improving your accuracies, to just guess the opposite. Okay. But I argued that we have those two intuitions in our heads, right? What I showed you was intuitions for warm, fuzzy items. But what happens if we ask people about responsibilism items, what I'm calling it? So one of the classic scales has this item, we should keep our aging parents with us at home. Guess what? Almost everybody gets that one right? So here's the actual data. 95% of people guess this right, whether it's the cultural psychologists or whether it's my MBA students. People get this one right. So if we ask people about tight, specific relationships, behaviors and duties in those relationships, people get those right. So I'm not saying that our intuitions are all wrong, it's just half of them are wrong, right? The warm, fuzzy half is wrong. The responsibilistic ones, those ones are right, okay? I want to say I'm not the first person to say this is not Thomas's theory. Like you can go through the history of social and cultural psychology and you can find lots of people who say similar things to what I said today. I'll just say, I'm less Luke Skywalker going in and blowing up the Death Star. I'm a little bit more like Johnny Appleseed, who did not invent the apple. He just tried to convince more people to eat the apple and grow the apple. As just two examples, so Harry Triandis back in the 90s, he has a line basically saying, if you're going to be a stranger, you'd rather be a stranger in an individualistic culture, right? So he's got an idea of like that, very similar. You can also think of like Brewer and Gardner's work on relational versus like group collectivism. I think that's pretty similar to what I'm talking about here. So this is not like Thomas invented this thing. It's just, I'm just trying to correct something that, a mistake that we keep making, put it that way. So what I'm going to propose is that we don't have to give up self-report scales. We can still use self-report scales. But if we use items, if we create new items to measure responsibilism, they'll work, okay? So that's what I did. I created 27 questions. I liked Kai Ping Peng's suggestion to use concrete scenarios so that we're all on the same page. So I really tried to define the situation, relationship, and I'm contrasting those warm fuzzies with the responsibilities. Also, when doing this, I created the scale in both Chinese and English from the start. I think too often we have a sort of an English-centric bias in psychology. So a scale gets created in English, and then I don't care if it's bad, sounds bad in your language or hard to translate, like just whatever, deal with it, right? And so to make that at least a little bit better, I created it in the two languages that I know first, and I would translate, so I'd write it in English because that's easier for me, and then I translate it into Chinese, and if it felt weird in Chinese, then I would change the English. Okay, until I got to something that sounded natural in both languages. Now, Chinese and English are very different languages, but they're not everything. This isn't perfect. I wish I had done it in 5 languages or 10 languages, but it's a start. Yeah, so if you do it that way, so here's the singlest scale item. I often do my own thing. They even put the quotes in the original, which is like a bad sign, right? Like you know, if you have to put something in quotes, it's going to be hard to translate to other languages. I think if you were going to design a scale in multiple languages from the beginning, you wouldn't choose items like that. And instead, you'd probably end up with very concrete items, right? Like I do what I want to do is a lot easier to translate. All right, here's the sample item. So you're working in a company for 2 years. One day you meet a coworker you've never met before. You're working on a sales account that could be a big accomplishment. The coworker starts asking you about the account. The item is, I would feel comfortable telling this coworker about the account. So what am I doing here? I'm defining the situation. So where are you? Who is this person? And what's the specific behavior? Okay, so trying to be really concrete about all of these elements, right? Now, just to be clear, I think that people in responsibilistic culture should not agree with this item because you don't know this person, right? You don't have a duty to this person, right? And paradoxically, it's people in individualistic cultures that should be comfortable sharing details with somebody that they don't know closely. Here's another one. So you live in an apartment with 4 roommates that you didn't know before you moved in. One day, a friend of your roommate who you don't know comes over, several friends, and they don't have enough room. So they're like, hey, can my friend sleep in your room tonight? And the item is, I would happily agree. So guess who agrees more with this item, right? Like Americans. Cultural psychologists guess that people in East Asia agreed more with that. Americans agreed more than migrants. All right, so I tested this around the world. This is why it took me about a decade to do. 16,000 people in 100 cultures around the world. So everywhere you see in red here is a culture that was included in the study. 45 languages, like most psych studies, were a bit more female than male. College students across most of the samples. Let's do that. All right, one way to compare it is to, you remember what Kai-Ping Peng did, where he just said, what percentage of the items go in the predicted direction? So I took all 27 of those and just said, how often do they go in the predicted direction? I compared Michigan, where I went to undergrad, to China, where I collected data. Hey, it's better than 50%, right? 81% is better than 51%. Is it a potential confound of language or translation? I ran it again in Hong Kong, where people are comfortable in English. So now we're testing across cultures, same language, and again, seems to work. Okay, so hey, we can get something that kind of works. All right, let's zoom out now. So I have all this data from around the world. I divided the world into 3 categories, very rough, simple categories: Western cultures, non-Western cultures like China and India, and in the middle we have what I call sometimes Western countries, countries that are hard to categorize, like Russia. Is it Western? Is it non-Western? I don't know. I'll just make a second category. Like Mexico, is it Western? Is it non-Western? I don't know. We'll just create another category. Okay. So to show you on the map, here are the Western countries as I categorize them. Here are the sometimes Western countries. I'm also including like Southern Europe. So we have like some evidence that places like Spain, Italy, and Greece are more collectivistic than like Germany and the UK. That's what I'm doing there. Latin America. And then here are the sort of clearly non-Western countries, cultures in my data set. So here are the differences between non-Western and Western countries. You can see those standard error bars are really small. So this difference, it's there, it's reliable. Where do the sometimes Western cultures score? Right in the middle, as you kind of expect. So that's nice. Here are the actual scores across cultures. So you can see broadly, it's like Latin America, Africa, Asia is more responsibilistic. Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, less responsibilistic. You can zoom in onto Europe and you can see differences within Europe. So you've got like Germany, France, UK, Norway that are more responsibilistic. Eastern Europe, less. Turkey, not surprisingly less. Like Spain, so more responsibilistic. All right, is this really different from other scales? I mean, am I reinventing the wheel here? I'm going to answer this a few ways. So I took the most cited collectivism scales and I gave those to a subsample of individuals. So in this, we're just going to be comparing individual level correlations. And here's how all the different scales correlate with responsibilism. On average, it's slightly negative, meaning that like on average, they're actually disagreeing with each other at the individual level. You can also do this at the cultural level. So instead of comparing individuals' responses, we can have the average across different cultures. So I took, Kuba Chris has data from 35 cultures. I added the next 4. with data from 50 cultures, which are these cultures that I'm showing you here. And then we calculated means for those 5 scales across all these cultures. And here's how they correlate at the culture level. And again, we find a negative average correlation. So on average, responsibilism and the previous scales are going in the opposite direction. Okay. But is this real? Is this actually measuring something that we should be calling collectivism? So I looked at relationships of this with different behaviors across countries. So there was a study a few years ago of lost wallets. So people dropped wallets in a bunch of different countries, tracked how many of them were returned. The warm fuzzy prediction is pretty obvious, right? If we think of collectivism as just being nice, we should find more wallets returned in collectivistic cultures. But the responsibilism prediction, I think, is also pretty clear that, like, wait a second, that's a stranger, right? It's not somebody I have a duty or a responsibility to. Here's the actual data. It's pretty clear. There was a fun study that the economists did on parking tickets at the United Nations. So UN headquarters is in Manhattan, right? Parking is notoriously difficult. Diplomats for many years had diplomatic immunity, so they knew that they could get parking tickets and didn't have to pay them, right? And so researchers tallied up the parking tickets for different countries' diplomats, right? So here we have so parking tickets. The warm fuzzy prediction is like, if you're just super nice, then you don't rack up the parking tickets. The responsibilism prediction is like, wait a second. So who's the person that's suffering if I get a parking ticket? Is it my friend? Is it my family? No, right? Who is it? It's the system, it's the stranger, it's the next guy to come along in their car, right? And who's benefiting? My guess is that most of these diplomats are not driving their own cars, right? And so it could even be the driver benefiting the diplomat, right? So it's probably a favor that's taken at the cost of somebody that you don't know. And that's indeed what the data seems to show. That's a log scale, by the way. So like Kuwait is up there at like log 5, almost log 6. That's a lot of parking tickets. There's also researchers who calculated a global collectivism index. This is things like divorce rates, 3-generation households, so like grandparents, parents, and kids all living together. And here's how responsibilism correlates with that. There's also a study that was done on what they call the passenger dilemma. So this asks you to imagine, it says, you're a passenger in a car, your friend's driving, and your friend hits somebody and the person dies. Now, if you testify in court that your friend was going under the speed limit, your friend will not get punished. But if you tell the truth and say that your friend was going over the speed limit, your friend will get punished very harshly. And the question is, it's not I would lie for my friend. The question is, my friend has the right to expect me to lie in court. And that's what we find, right? So this is that duty to the close friend, right? All right. How does responsibilism predict compared to those classic scales? So I took 7 markers of collectivism, like the ones that I've been showing you so far, calculated the average correlation between responsibilism and those markers. And then I did the same thing with the classic collectivism scales that I showed you before. If they're correlating in the correct direction, they're going to be in the green. If they're correlating in the wrong direction, we're going to see them in the red. So wrong direction would be like higher collectivism scores are predicting less lying for the friend. Okay, that would be the wrong direction. Here's how they score. So we see responsibilism predicting these behaviors in the direction that makes sense. The 2 single scales, not bad. And then we have 3 other scales predicting on average in the wrong direction. Right? Which makes sense with the fact that responsibilism often was correlating negatively with these other scales. Okay. Can these scales detect east-west differences? So here's one collectivism scale, US scoring higher than China. Here's another one, US is higher than China. Another one, same pattern. Another one, same pattern. Another one, about the same. And then here's responsibilism. So even that classic east-west difference that was so difficult to find, it's like we can find it with this scale, we can't with the other scales, okay? Sort of replicating that. Maybe this is just something about East Asia. So I took the correlations of, I just made a variable that's just 1, 2, 3, right? So each country gets a 1, 2, or a 3. And then here's how those scales correlate with those cultural differences. So responsibilism correlates highly with the West, non-West differences. some of the other scales significantly in the opposite direction. So these scales are showing that Western cultures are more collectivistic. Okay, that's what these are showing. Okay. Finally, I want to argue that, okay, even if you don't care about national culture, I think there are insights that might be of interest to you. So there are differences within cultures on this. So the northern US is known to be more individualistic than the South. And so I took my northern site at Michigan and compared it to two southern sites right here and find similar differences. Italy has that classic like South-North distinction. The South is sort of the mafia associated one. The North is sort of the more Western Europe associated one. I don't have a ton of data, so this is kind of speculative from Italy, but at least it seems in that direction where people from the South are scoring higher. Of course, I had to talk about rice and wheat. So here's rice-wheat differences within China. Socioeconomic status. So I tested students at the University of Illinois in Chicago, which is a much more economically diverse university in Chicago. And we find that in this more economically diverse school, people score higher. I also asked whether those scales could detect social class differences. So I asked, of those 16,000 people around the world, I asked them to rate their own social class. Responsibilism is negative, meaning that people of higher social class are less responsibilistic. The other scales, mostly positive on average. So they're showing the opposite relationship, okay? Finally, I want to leave you with politics. So psychologists have disagreed about whether we should think of conservatism or liberalism, at least in the United States, as more collectivistic or individualistic. So for example, there's this paper which goes through so many things about conservatism that seem to make it collectivistic, like it's associated with strong groups like churches and the military, which seem collectivistic. But then the author says, like, well, but liberals support welfare, which seems collectivistic, so I don't know, right? And to me, it's like, well, hang on, welfare is an anonymous system, right? Is welfare helping, is it you helping your family? Is welfare helping you helping your friends? No, right? It's an anonymous system that helps people equally, right? Based on abstract criteria, right? That actually sounds like individualism to me, right? Paradoxically. So I think we should think of liberals as individualistic and conservatives as responsibilistic, and that's what we find around the world. The different scales, so responsibilism is positively correlated with conservatism on the scale. The classic collectivism scales on average negative, so they're finding the opposite pattern. This reminds me of previous research on liberal conservative differences on identification with different social groups. So here's liberal conservative identification with their community. So that's pretty close. Country, conservatives higher, and then world. Right? So liberals are identifying more with the world, conservatives identifying more with closer social groups. Sounds like responsibilism to me. Another study asked people their loving feelings towards different relationships in their life. So romantic partner, high across the board, everybody feels high loving feelings towards them. Conservatives report more loving feeling towards their family than liberals. Friends, liberals a little bit higher. My favorite category is generic others. How much do you love generic others, right? Essentially strangers or people around the world. And liberals much higher on that, right? And if you compare the bars, liberals are essentially telling us that they love generic others more than they love their family. Now, it's a little unfair of me to say that, and there is no item in the scale that says I love the generic others more than my family. But you can see the responsibilism here, right? One group is emphasizing the far more than the near, and the other one's emphasizing the near more than the far. Okay. So what I hope to have left you with is a few things. One, I think it is possible to measure cultural differences without giving up self-report. Right? We can still use culture report, not saying we can't use culture report, but we don't have to throw self-report out. Second, our scales and our intuitions mix the warm fuzzy and the tight tie responsibilism. So beware, right? I think we all have those dueling intuitions in our head. So if you're ever thinking about cultural differences or trying to predict the results of a study, remember that we might be relying on these two different intuitions, and one of us will lead us astray, and I think the other will lead us in the right direction. And finally, this might be useful outside of traditional cultures, so like politics, social class, things like that. There are several, I think, enduring questions. One I'll just pull out of this. Are those warm fuzzy scales figments of our imagination? I would say no. those warm fuzzy scales, they do predict things. So just as one random example, it's not like a particularly important example, but they found that, like, for example, the Singulus scale correlated with people's reactions to being socially excluded. So it does predict things. It's just not predicting the cultural differences that are there, right? So these scales are measuring something. They're just not measuring collectivism as instantiated by cultural differences around the world. Okay? Thank you for listening. I think we're okay on time? Great. So we have time for a few questions.
So there is a question in the Q&A. It's whether there are gender differences. Does it map onto?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a firm answer. In general, I think women score higher on this than men, but this seems to differ across cultures in my data set. So for example, like the politics or the social class, more or less similar across cultures. So like conservatism is correlated with responsibilism in most cultures, but not all. But gender differences seem to really be more variable across cultures. And I don't have a good explanation for that. But I think one nice thing that might come out of this data set is we've got 100 cultures, we've got 16,000 people, we have a lot of demographics about people. There's so much to explore in this, right? All those different items, right? Like one fun thing would be to do like put random slopes on like gender across cultures and see if we could explain why it's positive in some cultures and negative in some other cultures. There's also there's a fun thing that there's an argument out there that, for example, social class. So in America, higher social class equals more individualistic. There's some evidence that in Japan, it's actually flipped. So people of higher social class are less individualistic. And so there's some argument out there for the idea that it's not that like social status just inevitably pushes people towards individualism. It's that it pushes people maybe towards the cultural ideal. Okay. And the ideal in the US is individualistic. The ideal in Japan is relying on other people or being responsive to other people. And so you could also test that with data like this. So I think that'd be a neat thing to test in this data.
Hello, thank you for coming here and this wonderful presentation. First of all, I was wondering, like you said that you classified countries into 3 categories, as I understand. And I wonder how you did this. Is it based on your like intuitions or any data?
Yeah. So what I did is I started with Huntington's classifications. So Huntington has like these classifications of.
Jump into that question as well, because I think there might be some interdisciplinary differences. Huntington defines Turkey as a torn country, not as non-West, but you put Turkey into non-West.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I was wondering if Turkey was going to come up today. I should have done more homework about my Turkey data here. So yeah, so I started with Huntington as sort of like a baseline. And then I tried to come up with some way of trying to make it a little bit less subjective. And so, for example, like Eastern Europe and Western Europe is like, where do you draw the line there? That seemed like really difficult to me. And so what I ended up doing was using the greatest extent of the Soviet Union as a demarcation of Eastern versus Western Europe. Like, I'm not going to die for that demarcation. To me, it's it's just something useful to do in the data. And it was a way of saying like, okay, let me use this political boundary as just a way that it's not me calling the shots. Like just let's call it a political boundary, right? Southern versus Northern Europe. I mean, I think you could easily put Spain, Italy, Portugal in with Northern and Western Europe, and I don't think it would be that different. But yeah, one interesting thing to come out of this though, so I have this tucked away in the supplemental materials in the paper. So you can put that category, so just the 1, 2, 3, into a regression and just say, what percentage of the variation around the world does that 1, 2, 3 explain, right? Nothing else, just a 1, 2, 3. And then let's run the same regression, and then let's just put dummy codes for every single culture. So now we're comparing 3 versus 100. Okay. And with 100 categories, we have to explain more variation than 3, right? But the interesting thing is, what's the difference between those two? How far apart are they? Are we talking like 2% of the variation versus like half the variation, right? And I wish I remember the specific statistic, but it's something like 25% versus 31%. It doesn't get you that much. Going from 3 to 100 doesn't get you that much, right? And 3 seems to get you a fair amount. So it seems to be getting us a decent amount. Now, is that papering over difference? Hell yeah. Like there's a lot of differences there that's not covering, right? Like all of South America, it's just the same, right? Oh, and South America is also the same as all the Caribbean countries. And like, yeah, obviously there's a lot of like mixture in there. So like, if you personally don't like that categorization, don't use it, right? Like I think none of the conclusions that I have here depend on you liking that categorization, right? I think what's much more important than that is to say, does this scale predict behaviors that are plausibly related to collectivism? And none of that depends on any of this, right? So if you don't like those categorizations, then don't use them. Yeah. Yeah, Taylor?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I hope I make sense, but your presentation flowed from the discrepancy between traditional fuzzy collectivism and responsibility as being the optimal reason for why self-recourse doesn't work. You also defined responsibilism being in responsibilism, behavior is coming prior to the emotions response. So I wondered whether in behavioral scales, the fundamental difference between collectivism and responsibility, is it apparent in behavioral scales? And my second question is it more apparent in behavioral scales than like they are in the self-report scales?
Yeah, if I could do this all over again, I might try to create questions that scale the different components that we're talking about, right? So I have like defining the situation, defining the relationship, I have duties, things like that. It'd be neat to create items that hit one of those or just this one or just that one and like move them all like sliders. Because what I'm doing in the scale is I'm sort of hitting like, I think this matters, so I'm going to turn that up to 100. I think this matters, I'm going to turn that up to 100. And this matters, I'm going to turn that up to 100, rather than just isolating each one. So if I could do it all over again, I'd probably try to do that. But in the classic collectivism scales that I showed you, there are some that actually kind of, I think, fit those different niches quite well. So like Susan Cross's scale, one of the neat things about her scale is that I want to say all or almost all the items use the words close relationships or something like that, like close friends or close relationships, right? And so like, I mean, maybe that's not as good as parents, because parents is like super concrete, but at least close relationships is like, it's not others, right? It's not people, it's close relationships, right? And so her scale, I think, does really well in the defining who it is. But then the items are mostly what I would call warm fuzzies, where they're like, my relationships are an important like window into who I am, right? And it's sort of like, it's like how you feel about yourself and your identity, which are like, to me, fuzzies and not really like concrete behaviors that I'm doing for other people. And so if you remember the correlations in there, so like hers is negative with mine. And so it seems like her scale is suggesting that even if the only thing that we change is specifying the relationship, it's still not enough, right? We need to also add in, I think, like something about duties, responsibilities, stuff like that. Yeah, and then you could also say like, well, what if we like don't specify who it is, but then it's about like duties and stuff like that. So I don't know how to good answer to that one. Yeah.
One more question from Zoom. So any ideas on whether and how responsibilism may impact cognitive style? I was thinking like, abstract, concrete.
Yeah.
Prevention.
Yeah, great question. I think there's a lot more we could do with this data set. I have subsamples of this that I gave the triad task, which is a measure of holistic versus analytic thought. So that's sort of like an east-west difference. And actually, one of the first steps that I did with this project that I didn't tell you guys about today back when I was in grad school, I had data for the singular scale, so one of the early scales, and then I had this cultural thought style measure, and then I took them item by item, and said, are there any items that correlate in the right direction with cultural thought style, and then are there any items that correlate in the wrong direction? And what I found is basically the warm fuzzy versus the responsibilism distinction at the item level. So for example, people who agreed with we should keep our aging parents with us at home tended to think more holistically, and holistic thought's more common in East Asia. But people who agreed with like the well-being of my coworkers is important to me, they thought more holistically, right? And so already at that item level, what I was finding is this cultural difference in thought style was sort of giving us a window into which it has different relationships with the warm fuzzies versus the items that I thought were responsibilistic. And then in some of this data, I have that too. So responsibilism correlates positively with holistic thought. So yeah, so there's a little bit of that, but I haven't looked at things like prevention focus, need for cognitive closure, might be another one. So, yeah.
Last question from the audience. Mehmet? Yes, of course.
Thank you very much. It was a fantastic talk. So your data very neatly shows that being responsibilistic is associated with not caring about strangers much. I was wondering about leak ties. So people we know, but we're not close to, they get lumped together with strangers, or I mean, do they get slightly better treatment than strangers if you're responsible?
Yeah. Good question. First, I want to applaud the audience for being able to say responsibilism and responsibilistic, because it's not easy. Trust me. So you guys have been doing a really good job with that. It's making me optimistic that like we'll get some traction here. To me, that's sort of an open question. So like when I wrote the scale, I have some items that are explicitly stranger. So like one of them's like you're walking on the street and a stranger starts talking to you, and it's like, okay, that's very clearly distant. And then I had some of those other items. I showed you the ones that I thought were sort of in the fun middle area of it's like, it's a friend of your roommate, right? So it's like, you don't know them, but you know, there's connection. Or the coworker that you don't know. So it's like same group, but like, you don't know them. And to me, like, I don't know, the data could have showed me that actually people in collectivistic cultures treat those people favorably, but the data did not show that. And so what seems to really come out in the data is that it needs to be somebody that you know personally and have a tie to. So that seems to be the big thing. So those items with like coworkers in cultures that people generally see as collectivistic, they are not sharing information with that person, for example, and that seems pretty clear. But I do think there is I think there are ways that cultures can deal with that. So I think that. So I teach negotiation at UChicago and to my MBA students. And business deals are one of those weird situations where it's like, even if you're in a collectivistic culture, you need to deal with a stranger and like solve this problem together. And so I think cultures that aren't generally favorable towards strangers sometimes build cultural practices that help us deal with that. So one in China is like karaoke. Or like banquets, right? So you go out to karaoke or like a banquet with a stranger to kind of like quickly build that tie and then get people across the finish line to like accomplish the business deal. So I think cultures are adaptive like that. And I think cultures can create situations where you can kind of like bring somebody in quickly and then it's okay, right? So it's like, it's not hopeless if you're a stranger, right? Like I've been treated very well today as one example. So anyway, yeah, good question.
Thank you so much. We have a 10-minute break and then we'll resume.
Okay. So welcome to the second half of our mini symposium, where we're gonna welcome Ayşe Üskül, who's a professor of social and cultural psychology at the University of Sussex since 2022. And she received her PhD from the York University in 2004, and we overlapped at Boğaziçi for 2 years. So I knew her from her childhood. Got her PhD from Toronto, Canada, and then did a postdoc at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And Ayşe's research in broad strokes centers around the role of culture and socio-ecological mechanisms in the concept of the self, interpersonal relationships, cognitive processes, etc. She's really well known for her work on socioeconomic basis of interdependence and the effect of culture on health behavior. She's the co-chief editor of the European Review of Social Psychology and the president of the psychology section of the British Science Association. She's received two very important awards in recent years, the Victoria Award from the European Association of Social Psychology and the Shapiro Diversity and Inclusion Award from SPSP. And the focus of Ayşe's research in more recent years has been on the cultural conceptions of honor and the role of honor in social irrational processes and how they may differ across cultures. And I think she's going to give us some highlights of that work today during her presentation. So without further ado, Ayşe, the floor is yours. At honor and Mediterranean society. Feels as if we're on a ship. There's this like waves. Do you hear the background noise, or is this going to go? Oh, it started to. Okay, yeah. So there was this association with water. Okay. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and then Özlem, especially for also being super flexible in getting my travel rearranged this week. So I'm really happy that I was actually able to make it today. Thank you all very much for coming. So I would like to share with you some data that we've been collecting for the last 5 years or so as part of an ERC project, which I designed to specifically focus on the Mediterranean societies, of which we know so little. I'm also giving some insights as to where Mediterranean societies fall when it comes to the comparisons that we have known about for a while, which is East Asia versus the West. So really over the past 30 years or so, I think cultural psychologists have established pretty convincingly that all sorts of psychological processes that we have been thinking to be universal are actually not universal. They are quite culturally variant. And Thomas has given lots of examples of that in his talk. It is always difficult to come after a talk where things have been said before you. So I'm just trying to shift things a little bit in my head. So this body of evidence has really highlighted both the importance and the underrepresentation of diversity in psychological processes. But our knowledge has been primarily coming from East Asia and the West. And this literature has really shown us this independence versus interdependence kind of, bipolar differences, showing that East Asians value things like harmony, relatedness, connectedness. They tend to construe themselves in more interdependent terms as embedded in social context. And they also tend to process information more holistically by, for example, attending to relationships between objects in a visual field. In contrast, members of Western societies have been shown to value things like autonomy, self-direction. They tend to construe themselves in more independent terms, directed by internal processes such as traits, goals, preferences, and so on. And they also tend to process information more analytically by, for example, focusing on a main object in a visual field. So this East Asia versus and the West binary approach has made us, I think, assume that whatever we have learned from East Asia applies to the rest of the non-Western world, which actually consists of the majority of the world in Kalçıbaşı's terms.
So we really wanted to go beyond this binary approach, beyond this binary understanding of the world, and by introducing evidence from an under-researched region, which is the Mediterranean. So why did we choose to focus on the Mediterranean region, apart from the fact that I'm from here and I was interested in learning more about this region? I think the literature has started providing us with the theoretical tool that we thought could help us, which we could use to understand this region. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of this tripartite distinction between dignity, honor, and face, introduced by Learning Cohen about a decade or so ago now. So they basically talked about this idea of cultural logics, which they defined as coherent cultural constellations of shared beliefs, values, practices, and behaviors that are organized as a central theme, which then shape individuals' orientations on core psychological processes. So they distinguish between dignity, honor, and face, and from previous research, we know that cultural logic of face tends to operate more heavily among East Asian societies. Cultural dignity operates more heavily in Western societies, and cultural honor operates more heavily in Latin American, Mediterranean, and potentially South Asian societies. So you can see some of the differences that this three-way distinction gives us to think about different parts of the world. But I think one important tool that this theoretical framework has given us is to start thinking about the differences that we might see within this, collectivistic body of non-Western worlds, right? So could there be actually some differences in what we have been assuming to be collectivistic, the ways in which people actually could be interdependent or function collectivistically? So two points about this table here is that it, for example, states that individuals in face and honor cultures might reach interdependence through humility and deference in East Asian face cultures, but through assertiveness and competitiveness in honor cultures. Okay, so the end goal might be the same, but how they get there might actually differ. This framework also refers to differences in sources of self-valuation. So where do we get the value of myself, either external or internal? And they say in the face cultures, it is more external, whereas in other cultures, it's both internal and external. So the point here is that it really gave us tools to think about, could we actually identify differences between different types of collectivisms, possibly? Or is there more variation within this non-Western world that we have not investigated yet? And the Mediterranean, why Mediterranean? Because we know from previous anthropological and social psychological research that Mediterranean societies tend to be societies where honor is a valued phenomenon, construct, which drives a lot of social behavior. So really, we started out by asking how interdependent, or are they interdependent, members of Mediterranean honor cultures, and how do they compare to members of East Asian face and Anglo-Western dignity cultures? But just to give you also an idea, this is a theoretical framework, and it hasn't really been investigated empirically frequently. So we actually also don't know whether Anglo-Western societies are dignity cultures and East Asian societies are face cultures. So even that is something that was left to establish empirically. Okay, so I think this question is a timely question because luckily there's a lot of interest emerging in recent years within the cultural psychological literature where people started asking, well, is there actually some variation within the non-Western world when it comes to types of interdependencies, for example, people that might be experiencing? Or, for example, Alvaro and colleagues talked about self-assertive interdependence in the Arab region. So there is interdependence, but these people also tend to think of themselves in an inflated way. So there's some element of independence combined with other elements of interdependence. Salvador and colleagues talked about emotionally expressive interdependence. Again, It's interdependence, but there's a lot of emotional expression coming through, when it comes to anger, pride, and all sorts of different emotions in Latin America. And Kirsten and colleagues talked about independent selves in Latin America. So it's not just this, this happy pool of super interdependent people that we see outside of the West. So we did our research primarily around the Mediterranean, gathering data from Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Lebanon, and Egypt. And we tried to get our data from parts of those countries where we thought we might be able to get at this concept of honor much more easily. So we didn't choose Athens, but we chose Crete, for example. We chose Granada or Madrid or Barcelona. So we also tried to gather data from places where anthropology gave us some idea about where might honor matter more. We also wanted to anchor this new pool of knowledge within what we already know. That's why we also collected data from Korea and Japan, as well as the UK and the US. So I'm just going to talk about interdependence, independence, and social orientation and cognitive style, as well as self-construal first, and then move on to honor, dignity, face. So we wanted to have a bunch of different measures. Both implicit and self-report measures. So just following up on Thomas's talk, I think cultural psychologists being dissatisfied with this idea that, self-construal measures in particular, but generally self-report measures are tainted with all sorts of biases and so on. How else can we measure people's orientation? And one approach to that problem was to come up with what people call implicit measures. So participants are given tasks where it's not readily clear to them that they are, for example, providing evidence or rating themselves in an interdependent way or an independent way. So, for example, in one task, people are given 10 situations that they have likely experienced in the past. They're watching a movie or talking to their friends, and then they will rate a bunch of emotions in that particular situation that they recall. How did they feel? And some of these emotions were socially engaging emotions, which connect people with other people, either negative or positive, so shame or connectedness feelings, for example. And some emotions were socially disengaging emotions, such as anger and pride, so they kind of disconnect people from each other. Okay, so make them distant. And another task was social happiness bias. So we took these, the intensity of socially engaging and socially disengaging emotions and used them as a predictor of people's happiness. So what is a better predictor? We gave them the iOS inclusion of in the self scale with lots of different targets and calculated feelings of closeness to in-group members versus feelings of closeness to out-group members. And we also asked individuals to draw a sociogram where they draw a Venn diagram for themselves as well as for their friends. And we took the size of the self circle and looked at it in relation to the average size of the friend circles that they drew to see whether they were actually drawing themselves bigger in comparison to the circles that they used to draw their friends. And what we know from the literature is that a stronger interdependent social orientation is typically associated with having a tendency to experience socially engaging emotions over socially disengaging emotions. So you're more likely to experience shame and closeness and so on over anger and pride. And also you have, if you're interdependent, your happiness is more, better predicted by the intensity of these socially engaging emotions. Again, if you're interdependent, you feel closer to in-group members over out-group members, and you also tend to draw others bigger than yourself in a sociogram task. We also had measures of cognitive style. So these are all measures that others have been using for a while. None of this is ours. We had a task that measured the situational attribution bias to see whether people attributed the reasons of different situations to situational versus dispositional factors. We used a triad task that Thomas talked about earlier, where we wanted to see whether people tend to categorize objects in more relational or categorical ways. So, for example, in this example, you would say, you know, which 2 out of 3 go together. So that's the question. If you say cow and the chicken go together, you're thinking they're both animals, so they go to the same category. So that would be a categorical response, or if you could say the cow eats the grass, and we're thinking about objects in relational terms, so then that would be a relational way of responding. We also had another task where we gave participants 22 pieces of information related to a murder case and asked them to indicate which ones they considered as relevant to solving the case. And that's about understanding to the extent to which people take contextual information into account when they're trying to attribute reasons to the behavior, you know, like why did this happen, which information do I need to solve the case. And an outside-in task is participants indicated the extent to which they tend to take a first person versus a third person perspective when they recall their past events. Okay, so that's, you know, are you remembering things as if you're watching a movie and you're there in the movie, or are you actually remembering that as if you know you're looking from yourself to the you know outside, so you're actually not in the movie and you're remembering the rest of the situation that doesn't include you. And again, a holistic or an interdependent cognitive style will be associated with making more situational attributions over dispositional attributions, taking more contextual information into account, categorizing objects on the basis of their relationships, like the cow eating the grass, and taking a third person perspective over a first person perspective. We had a few other measures, but you know, if I chose to do everything here, we would probably be here for an hour. So, okay, and also I started with having lots of graphs, and then I decided I'm not going to do this because it was just going to be too overwhelming. So I'm just going to summarize the results across these 8 different implicit tasks, measuring social orientation and cognitive style. So first of all, just to look at pairwise differences, starting with East Asia versus Anglo-West, because this is almost allowed. And for the most part, we find what others have shown. So the East Asian participants showed a stronger interdependence across these different tasks when compared with Anglo-Western participants, so 6 out of 8. East Asian participants also showed greater interdependence compared to Mediterranean participants in 4 out of 8 tasks. On 2, they didn't differ, and on the other 2, Mediterranean participants were more interdependent. And the Mediterranean participants were much more like the Anglo-Westerners, if you see the number of gray cells there, than they were to East Asian participants. Okay, in 3 out of 8 tasks, and the Westerners actually were more interdependent compared with Mediterraneans. Okay, so we don't really have this. East Asians and Mediterraneans are all interdependent across different implicit tasks. So this is an explicit measure, right? So this is a self-construal measure by my colleague Virginie Vigneault at the University of Sussex. It is an I think we chose to use this one because this scale was developed cross-culturally, taking into account input from lots of researchers around the world. And it's also a bipolar scale, which is one way in which to combat some of the response style biases in self-report scales. And it also covers different aspects of life. Okay, so there are 8 different dimensions to this scale. So it doesn't give you just one independent or one interdependent score, but it actually gives you a much more kind of fine-grained understanding of how individuals define themselves independently or interdependently across different domains of life. So you can see some of the examples, the 8 dimensions here and some example items.
Okay, so these are the 8 dimensions of that scale. And the higher the ratings, the more interdependent a person defines him or herself. And the lower the ratings, the more independent they define themselves. And 0 is basically, neither independent or interdependent. So what we see here is that across 8 dimensions of explicit self-control, members of Mediterranean societies showed a largely independent profile, both in absolute and relative terms. So on average, they emphasized difference, self-direction, self-reliance, consistency, self-expression, and decontextualized self. So they were higher, significantly higher on these compared to both East Asian and Anglo-Western societies, okay? And on 2, so these are connection to others and commitment to others, they scored again significantly higher than the members of both Anglo-Western and East Asian societies. Okay, so across the board, we see a more independent profile than an interdependent profile, but there are elements, life domains, if you wish, 2 of them on which they scored more interdependently. So what we see here is that East Asian samples, as one would expect, are largely more interdependent than Anglo-Western samples, so we nicely replicate previous work. But East Asian samples are also largely more interdependent than Mediterranean samples. And in fact, Mediterranean samples were much more like the Anglo-Westerns than East Asians. So that gives us some evidence for lack of a uniform pattern of interdependence across 2 regions of the majority world. Of course, there's Africa, there's South Asia, there's Eastern Europe, there's Latin America, none of which is covered here. But we zoom in to different regions and we actually start identifying that we're not talking about this kind of one big non-Western world that can be treated the same. So of course, I mean, the Mediterranean region is highly diverse itself. Right, so there are different religious groups, linguistic groups, ethnic groups, and they live in societies that are very different from each other in terms of economic development and so on. So we also wanted to zoom into this big Mediterranean region, big non-Western and big Mediterranean. So these are still very big regions. So we created subgroups within this Mediterranean region using some ways of creating subgroups according to a bunch of sociologists. These basically categories were created along ethnic, linguistic, and religious lines. So we have Latin Europe here, Spanish and Latin, Italian samples. We have the Southeastern Europeans, the Greeks and the Greek Cypriots. And then we have the Middle Eastern and North African group with Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt. And I think we had Turkish Cypriots in this data as well, so I don't remember. Okay, so what we're basically seeing, this is a forest plot. So the gray line in the middle indicates no difference between groups, okay? And the red dots represent the 2-way comparisons between the 3 Mediterranean subgroups. And the blue dots represent the 2-way comparisons between East Asian, Mediterranean, and Anglo-Western groups. And what is important here is that the blue dots are much farther apart, which means they're they're less similar to each other or more different from each other compared to the red dots that are closer to the gray line, okay? Which is an indication that the subgroups within the Mediterranean region are much more like each other when they are compared to these 3 big world region comparisons that we made. Okay, so there's something about the Mediterraneans that make them similar to each other. By the way, just a cautionary note here, I didn't start this research but with an aim to come up with a simplified narrative about a Mediterranean regional identity. I think anthropologists ditched this idea probably 3-4 decades ago. So I'm not here to kind of revive that. But the whole idea is to basically put the Mediterranean region on the map of psychological knowledge and increase the representation of this group of people. I think this is really important for our science. But I think it is important that this is, this region is less like the East Asia, and also not so much like like the West. But the Latin Europeans, the Southeastern Europeans, and the Middle Eastern and North Africans are much more like each other than they are similar to the other two world regions, which I just said. Okay. So far, what I have shown you is basically mean differences, right? And there is only one way in which we can understand different world regions. I think another question that we need to start asking more frequently, some of us have been doing this for a while, what functions does stronger independence in the Mediterranean region serve? So they might be more independent, but perhaps this independence actually serves some sort of an interdependence, right? That is quite possible. So this was an afterthought. We did not start our research with this question in mind, but we were quite shocked actually to see that the Mediterraneans were so independent. Why so? And also inspired by Alvaro and colleagues' research, where they're talking about assertive interdependence. Maybe the assertiveness aspect that they refer to might have something to do, might be in the service of some sort of interdependence. So we haven't had a well-being measure in our study, and that measure had 2 items that focused on social well-being, asking individuals to rate or to indicate how satisfied they are with personal relationships and feeling part of their community. So an indication of social well-being, we basically predicted the social well-being index, average of 2 items, with social orientation measures and self-control measures, okay? So what we basically saw across the 3 regions is that feeling close to your in-group, and defining yourself in connected ways and independent ways from others, as well as being consistent across different situations, significantly predicted social well-being. Okay, so there are no regional differences in the predictions across these 4 indicators. We also found that defining oneself as committed versus self-interested, so these are bipolar dimensions, remember, from Mini-Symposium scale, predicted social well-being among members of the Mediterranean as well as East Asian samples. Okay, so there here we see some similarity between the 2 collectivistic regions. And look at this here. So there are 3 additional independent indicators. So defining oneself as self-expressive, as self-directed, and also drawing yourself bigger. So having an inflated self significantly predicted and positively predicted social well-being. Okay, so we had a situation that in the Mediterranean sample, social well-being was predicted by a range of social and self-related indicators for interdependence and independence. All right. In contrast, with the exception of consistency, none of the indicators of independence emerged as a significant predictor of social well-being in the East Asian sample, for example. Okay. So this pattern emerging from the Mediterranean region suggests that seemingly independent ways of construing oneself may have functions that support social inclusion, remembering the items of social well-being, and arguably interdependence. So perhaps, being self-directed or expressing yourself in social situations might eventually serve your relationships or somehow put you somewhere on the social hierarchy. Okay. So I'm most excited about this finding, which was an afterthought, but I think it is something that we might want to dig into a little bit more. So it is important to considering what psychological needs particular forms of independence and interdependence may serve before categorizing regions based on mean levels alone. I think that's something important to think of. Mean levels versus correlations, right? So what they give us, they might give us different insights. Okay, so far I've been making the assumption that Mediterranean is a known culture, generally speaking, but we actually started this work also asking the question, are they an honor culture or not? So we measured societal perceptions as well as personal endorsement of honor, taste, and dignity culture logics in these 3 regions. We use value measures as well as concern measures. I'm just going to talk about value measures today. It's a much simpler story to tell. Concerns are also very multifaceted, very complicated, but it is in a paper that is being revised at the moment, so hopefully we can read more about that in the future. Okay, so we asked people to rate honor values, face values, and dignity values. You can see the example items here. I just want to say one thing about dignity, because that's sometimes, we might associate some value attached to this. So we think about people as, or ourselves as dignified people, and if we score low, this is actually not so. But I think dignity, the way Reverend Cohen is describing, is that it can be captured by items like people should be true to themselves regardless of what others think. So it's really what matters is you and your ideas and your traits and your own opinions. You can basically not so much regard what other people think. So that's the gist of it. So just again, also building on Thomas's talk, we had two ways of asking them to rate these items. How much do you agree or disagree with these statements? So that's self-endorsement. How much would most people in your society agree or disagree with the following statements? Okay, so we're also trying to capture this, what we call intersubjective culture. So how we think our, others in our society score on those things. Okay, so with dignity, right, no surprises here. So the Anglo-Western parties, so these are perceived societal values. It's how we perceive our society. Anglo-Westerns think that others actually value dignity quite a bit, and that's significantly more so than other societies. And look at East Asia. East Asian participants actually don't think that people in their society value dignity that much. But they do think that most people in their society value face. Right? So again, and this is significantly higher than the other four regions. And here I'm giving a 5-region distinction. Okay, so we're here also looking at sub-regions within the Mediterranean. So this basically nicely captures what we have been thinking about East Asia and the West in terms of dignity and face. And when it comes to honor, perceived societal honor values, we see that the Middle Eastern North African societies think that most people in their society value honor. And that is, they are followed by Southeastern Europeans and Latin Europeans. Okay. The pattern with personal endorsements of dignity, face, and honor values is similar, but also different. So again, the Anglo-Western participants value dignity the most. But when it comes to face, despite the East Asians saying, well, most people in my society value face, when it comes to asking, well, how much do you value it, they're actually right down here. It is the Middle Eastern and North Africans that value face more than the other 4 regions. And again, we replicate the perceived societal honor value pattern with personally endorsed honor scores here, where Middle Easterners and North Africans can say, well, I actually value honor more, and they do so more than the other 4 regions. But they're always there's a pattern that is the MENA, the Middle Eastern North Africans are here, followed by Southeastern Europeans, followed by Latin Europeans, and Latin Europeans rarely differ actually from the Anglo-Western face or East Asians when it comes to honor. Okay, so you might have noticed or not, but these are data with popularly called young adults, my students. So we wanted to replicate this pattern, or we wanted to see whether this pattern would replicate with the general population. So we went ahead and collected data from the general population using survey companies and so on. And basically, we have data only on honor values in this study. We did not measure dignity or face, because when you start paying, then you need to start thinking about the number of items that you can include. So here we have a slightly bigger sample of countries. So we have Tunisia, which we didn't have in the previous study. We have Canada, yeah, I think these are the two additions in this data set. And in other data sets that I'm not presenting today, we also have Morocco, and so we're trying to capture more countries in the Mediterranean as we go ahead. Okay, and again, what we see here, so these are perceived societal honor values, and again, you see that Participants in the Middle East and North African region think that most people in their society value honor quite strongly and more so than in the other 4 regions. And we see the same thing for personally endorsed values as well. So at the very least, I hope that these results will help people to think about where they would like to choose their sample if they want to study others. At the very least, this gives us an insight where it's really valued. So, well, I rarely give data. I usually present regional data, but I could not say anything about Turkey, given I'm here, because we have Turkey. And I think it's really interesting. I actually had not thought about it until yesterday on the plane when I was putting this together. So here we see perceived societal undervalues from the student data. So in terms of, see, these are factor scores, okay? So these are not mean scores. Factor scores are nice because they give us some indication across different samples relative to each other, right? So, and the other nice thing that we wanted to do, and we managed to do it, we have a comparable number of men and women pretty much in every society. So we're also looking at gender data, because honor is highly gendered, so we did not want to overlook that. So we basically see here all societies and divided by men and women. So we're actually treating them as different cultural groups in our multi-level modeling. So here you see in terms of perceived societal endorsements with dignity, they're low. They're quite high together with Japan and Korea when it comes to perceived societal endorsement of face. But they're also high here with Egypt and Lebanon when it comes to perceived societal endorsement of honor. So both face and honor seem to matter, or people think that most people in their society endorse honor and face, and they are almost like this very stereotypical image of Turkey between East and West, but they're between East Asia and the Middle East, right? So that's you know, the Asia part of it. And the Mediterranean part of it seems to be really captured, I think, in this slide. So this is personally endorsed honor values, okay? And again, we see the same pattern here. They're low on dignity, but again, with Egypt and Lebanon, they're quite high, especially Turkish men. And also for, sorry, this is face. Yeah, but remember, when I showed face, for personally endorsed face, the Middle Eastern, North African sample, that was higher than even the East Asian. So that's basically this. You see this every country looking down. But they're also higher here with Egypt and Lebanon when it comes to personal endorsement of honor. So these are, remember, students being asked, what do you think of most people in your society? And students are always, I think, interesting bunch in the sense that they don't really represent the rest of the society, whatever culture you go to. So we also wanted to see this in study 2. This is data from the larger population in every society. And here you see that it's actually not that high. So the Turkish male men are here when it comes to personal endorsement of honor, and Turkish women even lower than them. And perceived societal endorsement of honor, Turkish men are here and Turkish women are here. So they're not up high here, right? So when it comes to asking people from the larger generation, from the larger population, you see a slightly different pattern, but they are still not low, right? So they are somewhere in the middle. Okay. So we basically tried to map the prevalence of dignity, face, and honor values, and show the relative importance of dignity in Anglo-Western context and of face in East Asian context, especially when it comes to perceived societal values. And honor values were most prevalent in samples located farther east and south within the Mediterranean region. Okay. So this might make you think, well, aren't Italians or Spanish honor-oriented? I mean, there's huge data from Patricia Rodriguez Mosquera, for example, where she worked as Dutch versus Spanish, and that, you know, showing that honor motive. So I just want to, again, add a cautionary note here. Most of this understanding comes from mean levels. And we also find in other work that we have been doing, including some studies where ours was part, we do not always find the expected mean differences between groups, but when it comes to what honor does to other social and psychological outcomes, that's where you see the impact of it. So people not scoring high on something doesn't mean that doesn't have actually any guidance role in people's social behavior. So these are essentially sometimes two different things. So we also challenge the idea of uniform honor cultures by revealing sub-regional differences in the Mediterranean regions. Okay, not all Mediterranean societies are the same. Cultural differences were more pronounced in societal perceptions of values in one society. In personal endorsements, it was a little bit messier. Okay, so people perhaps they were much more, it might be stereotypical, it might be real, we don't know, but their perceptions of their society seems to be going along with the academic expectations at least. Okay, right. How much time do I have left? Please, you don't. You're just so taken by my talk.
It's as soon as possible.
As soon as, oh my God, okay. Okay, I'll try to keep this possible. So, okay, the other interesting question for us was, okay, we might know, right, honor matters or faith matters or dignity matters, but honor for now, this is where my interest lies. Does knowing that honor is valued more or less in certain world regions actually help us understand other psychological processes? So, for example, independence, interdependence, or collectivism and individualism have been used as an underlying mechanism, right? So that makes us more pro-social, or that makes us more responsible, or that makes us more free, right? So does honor make us do anything? Is it an underlying factor? Is it an underlying mechanism when it comes to understanding regional or cultural differences in social psychological processes? So we had some theoretical kind of hunch for this, which I'm not going to go into because obviously I don't have much time. But in two outcomes that we had included in the study, there might be more, which we might not have included. But basically, we found that perceived societal honor values explain group differences in tendencies to experience disengaging, socially disengaging of their socially engaging functions. And they also helped us understand group differences in whether situations were remembered from the third person versus the first person perspective. So this is basically the figure of this. So here we see Mediterranean societies versus other, okay, the other two groups, Anglo-West and East Asians not together. So Mediterraneans perceive their societies to value honor more, and that in turn is associated with them experiencing disengaging emotions such as anger and pride more intensely than socially engaging emotions such as shame and connectedness. So when we run an orthogonal contrast with Anglo-Western versus East Asians, honor values do absolutely nothing. So for that comparison, honor values is not a significant mediator. And the same thing happens when it comes to third-person perspective taking. So I think this somehow makes sense to me. A bit post-hoc, I have to acknowledge. We did have a hunch about this, which is in the paper. So I think this tells us, because one is a third-person perspective taking is an interdependent cognitive mechanism. Okay, so you see yourself as if somebody else is looking at you, which might help you monitor your own behavior and regulate and so on. And the other one is actually feeling emotions such as anger and pride more intensely than other connecting, socially engaging emotions, which might help you to get some status on this very unstable social hierarchy that tends to exist in many honor cultures. So again, we're finding this in honor culture basically being a significant mediator for an independent and an interdependent outcome. Right. So it's really very fascinating and very different to how we have been thinking about cultural differences. Okay, so the summary, the interesting thing, Thomas, is I think this connects to what you said earlier. We don't find personally endorsed honor values acting as a significant mediator. And I think this actually goes hand in hand with how Leung and Cohen operation conceptualized cultural logics, because cultural logics are not necessarily things that we own. These are the constellations of cultural practices and behaviors and institutions and so on that seem to define how we live and where we live. Okay, so if I think that most people in my society value X, that is likely to influence my behavior or be associated with my behavior, even if I don't endorse that. Okay, so I think that is an important finding, and a lot of other people find that intersubjective cultural measures predict certain social psychological behaviors better than internalized values or attitudes or traits, for example. Okay. So I'll just give you some take-home points before I end. So the Mediterranean region has a unique combination of independent and interdependent tendencies. So there's no one story that defines this region or clear story. And if you like this, come to our project. Studying honor helps us make sense of cultural variation, in particular psychological tendencies, which I think is the first time this, we have shown this, and I think there's a lot of promise. And for us, we should be asking what more psychological tendencies, what more cultural variation in psychological tendencies can honor actually explain. In cultural environments and logics, and here I'm referring to perceived societal prevalence of values, can foster ways of being, relating, and behaving that are culturally specific, even if we don't endorse them ourselves. And again, I would like to end by saying, let's be cautious against developing and relying on new clear-cut categories to describe cultural variation. Again, this is not the goal of this work, but just really to highlight further cultural variation. And so amazing group of people I've been working with in this project, and without them, this could not have been really produced, and it is still ongoing. We have 2 more years to go, and hopefully more data to come. And thank you for your attention. And here are some papers that you could maybe look up to read more about some of these findings that I presented today. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Thank you.
One of the fun things that I found in my studies, I didn't mention this earlier, but in the US and in Hong Kong, I had people rate themselves and then their culture for responsibilism. So I randomized people to that. And I found that for Americans, it basically didn't matter. They rated themselves the same as America, but for Hong Kong, it mattered. There was more of a discrepancy. And I wonder if that's something that you've looked at in your data. It's like, I don't know if you can see that as individualism. It's like, other people are like whatever I am, other people probably are.
Yeah.
And it's nice that you have like enough data from more cultures where you both have self and culture, and like maybe that in and of itself is an interesting variable. Like, what's the discrepancy?
So we looked at the correlation between the ratings, and they're highly correlated. We have not necessarily looked at it. Well, are there cultural differences in the correlations? But overall, when you look at it overall, there's like 0.8, 0.9.
Wow. Yeah.
Across the board. But I'll look.
Yeah.
But I'll dig into that data to see whether there are any group differences in level of correlations. Yeah. But overall, it doesn't seem to be that way.
Just one quick question. The last slide you showed us with the visual perspective taken, was that young adults only?
This one?
That one? Young adult data? Was this?
This is the young adult data.
Do we at all know what they recall, really kind of events they recall?
So this one is a task from Goods and Cohen. I think we asked them what they recalled. I have to go back. I believe this is the one where they remember. So they choose what they remember. I think that's the one. And then they rate how they remembered. Yeah, yes. We might have asked them to write it down But we're working with 8 languages here. Usually we don't do much with open language data, but it is probably there.
We are very much interested for some coding the content.
Yeah, sure.
Perspective from that.
Yeah.
It would be very interesting.
Yeah. I'll check my memory. I think we asked them and they wrote it down, but if we have data, I'll get back to you. Yeah.
On a similar note, I would like to ask whether have you ever come across studies that focused on honor versus shame aspect of being a queer individual? Because like, I'm familiar with your work thanks to childhood and language lectures, but I was thinking about this third-person perspective, taking a perceived societal honor. What would you hypothesize for queer people in Mediterranean regions in terms of their perceived feelings of shame within the concept of this increased patterns of feeling perceived societal honor? Or have you ever come up with studies like that? Is that clear?
Yeah, it's clear. I'm just trying to think whether we had any item, value item or concern item that focused on shame specifically. I can't recall. I have to go back to what we asked, different studies in which we asked different things. I mean, shame is a very interesting emotion. I'm not an emotion researcher, but shame is usually talked about in, especially Kitayama's and colleagues' terms, as a socially engaging emotion. So you feel shame, and then that motivates you to do something about that incident. So and that helps you rebuild, repair your relationship with the other and so on. Whereas anger and pride doesn't work the same way, for example. And we find that actually the intensity of socially engaging emotions is higher in other cultures than the intensity of socially engaging emotions. So they're more likely to experience, at least in the context of the 10 situations that we gave them, they're more likely to experience these socially disengaging emotions over socially engaging emotions. So I'm not sure what that means in terms of the role of shame in these cultures, right? Maybe it is the situations that didn't capture shame. I'm sure that embarrassment and shame actually motivates a lot of the sometimes toxic behaviors that we see in other cultures, right? But I'm not sure to what extent we're able to capture this here. But there are studies out there that look at shame in the context of other cultures.
Thank you.
So there's one question from the audience on Zoom, and it's kind of like, I guess, pushing you towards more compartmentalization of even the Mediterranean region, and the comments like, Bolu is its own thing, What if you collected data from another city in Turkey? I mean, the same thing can be said about Spain. I mean, Sevilla is very different than Madrid, etc. So, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, this Bolu, Granada, Crete, that is study 1, right? So study 2 is from it's all over the place. It's not, I wouldn't say representative, because I don't think any online study in any of these countries could possibly be representative, because there are huge connection issues still in this part of the world. So we do replicate to a great extent the patterns that we see in the student sample in the second study, where we have data from the general population. So that's one answer to that question. And we also don't want to say that Bolu represents Turkey or Granada represents Spain. Clearly, no, I wouldn't make that claim. Just in my defense, all the textbooks in psychology are probably also Michigan and Stanford students. So to the extent that we start questioning that, I would like to welcome that question as well.
Last question.
Okay, so it's about the content of the unrelated situations. So it may be a similar question, but can we say that, or is there any on that, across generations? So when we ask people what are the other affecting situations, or what could be the most important value in terms of honor, so they can give across generations that might be some different answers. So do you think that there's a different pattern with the new generation in terms of what affects your honor, for instance?
We have a paper published on this. So we asked students to give us situations in which they think would attack people's honor, and also situations that would enhance people's honor. But we did not. Well, I guess when you ask the question in that way, which is generic, you probably think as a participant of situations that would attack anybody's honor, right? Not necessarily your own, but you might imagine that if you insulted somebody's mother, that might impact their honor, right? But this might not be in your reality, but you might still know about these realities that other people experience, and you might produce that situation as a kind of prototypical situation of an honor attack, right? But we have not done any study that would give us any insight into generational differences or what people might consider an honor attacking situation to be, or an honor enhancing. So we don't have that kind of generation. I think that when it comes to culture, there are a lot of things that we know of our culture, even though they may not necessarily define our own reality. That's why I think what we ask and how we ask really matters. Well, we have a paper in JCCP 2012 which exactly did that. So I don't know.
I know. I just want to say yes. Generation differences.
Yeah, no, that we don't know.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.